Welcome to Moral Politics. I'm your host, Bill Wolford. All people of conscience must oppose Israel's genocide of the Palestinians. Sadly, few ever stand up for moral principles, especially human rights. The freedom sailors of the Free Gaza movement did. Their story is recounted in a book entitled Freedom Sailors. 44 intrepid activists broke the siege on Gaza. They broke it long enough to bring hope to the Palestinians, and they broke it long enough to expose Israel's sadistic occupation. Dr. Bill Dienst, a freedom sailor himself, joins me. We discuss the harrowing tales of heroism in the newly released book, Freedom Sailors. It is my pleasure to welcome returning guest to Moral Politics, Dr. Bill Dienst. Welcome.
It's good to be here again, Bill. Thanks.
Were you motivated by principle when you set sail as a freedom sailor?
As a child, I said the Pledge of Allegiance, and the most important line is liberty and justice for all. Yet our alliance with Israel seems to go against that principle, in that we have Israel that's a privileged country and Palestinians who are locked up in this cage called Gaza.
Interesting you describe Gaza as a cage. So many other people have described it that way also. But I'm curious, I want to know the saga, this tale of heroism.
In about 2006, there were human rights activists for Palestine that had been involved in exposing the atrocities that were going on in Lebanon. And it was feared that an impending attack of Gaza was next.
Yeah, I remember watching that on TV. It actually is what I cite as the reason for my being involved in Palestinian rights.
But we were driven by idealism. We were driven by the need to do something rather than just watch the oppression of the Palestinian people and remain in despair.
But you were driven by idealism, but weren't you concerned?
We staged the boats from Greece. And the one thing about Greece is it has thousands upon thousands of islands and coves and harbors and ships and boats, and so it was, and we had the boats were kept in two separate harbors under their original Greek names, and it was a need-to-know effort. It was done clandestinely.
And this is because you really did fear what the Mossad might do, which was very similar to what they did in 1988.
Yes, and they were looking for us all along.
Well, I noticed in the book you're always referencing, the hulls were being checked constantly, having frogmen check the bottom of your boats.
And yeah, to try to forego something before it became a disaster.
Do you think the Mossad actually did shadow you at any time?
Oh, several times. Initially the boats, when they were in the dry dock and being developed, one was in one harbor called Spetses Harbor, south of Athens, and the other one was in a harbor called Eritrea, north of Athens, and nobody, except for those directly involved with the boats, knew where the boats were.
Now, we know that the Mossad, they did their dastard deed in 1988, and there was no reason to suspect that if they were given the green light, they wouldn't do it again in 2008. Now, I know that 44 of you actually set sail.
That's right, from 17 different countries around the world.
And did you have any idea what you were encountering? Gunboats and,
oh, sure.
And the sea?
We knew what the risks were. We knew that Israel has the fourth largest military in the world, and which includes an advanced navy with high-speed warships and submarines and air surveillance and all kinds of things. Potential mines at sea. There were all kinds of things that we knew that we might encounter. And again, we relied on international media coverage as our only defense.
Did they electronically jam any communications?
We had put thousands of dollars into sophisticated real-time internet broadcasting because we felt our only defense would be that if they attacked us at sea, we could broadcast the attack on the international airwaves. But they beat us in that tennis match when we wound up 70 miles off the shore of Israel in international waters. Our entire communication systems was jammed. And this was in the middle of the night in stormy seas. We had a member of the Greek parliament aboard our ship, the Liberty, and when they jammed us, it worked against Israel, because then the Greek government, the Cypriot government, and the Arab League all launched formal protests on our behalf, and they thought that we had been lost at sea.
Is that the sentiment of the Greeks and the Cypriots, is that they are pro-Palestinian?
Among the majority of the Greek and Cypriot people, that is true. The governments, however, are somewhat different, and they're under pressure from international finance. For example, a couple years later, 3 years later, when we attempted Freedom Flotilla 2, the Greek government came under tremendous pressure from the Americans and the Israeli government to stop the departure of our boat from Greece. And in effect, Israel exported or outsourced their suppression of maritime law, basically.
I know in the book you described these boats as rickety and that they were over capacity. I think you were too many people on board, and fan belts were giving out, and all kinds of just issues to captain and a first mate simultaneously coming ill.
And that was on the Free Gaza. I was aboard the Liberty, so I didn't witness that episode myself, but Greta Berlin, who's my co-editor and authors several of the pieces, describes that. And that remains a mystery to this day. They became sick. They were veteran seamen, and so they'd been at sea lots. So why they became sick all of a sudden was a bit of a mystery.
Can't actually attribute that to the Mossad, but the suspicion is not removed.
Sure, and there's lots of episodes. One of our activists, Hetty Epstein, who's 84 years old, she's comes from a family where all of her family members were exterminated by the Nazis. Well, she was one of our activists, and she intended to sail with, and she had an event a couple days before we left, and we had the same suspicion. Had she been poisoned? Well, she recovered, but as a result of that episode, she was not able to sail with us. And but all the time we're wondering, when bad things happen mysteriously, who's behind it. And the problem about espionage is you can never be 100% sure about anything.
Well, I want to go back to the motivation. We touched on it slightly about the outrages that were prevalent at this time. Again, this sailing took place August 2008, but I think a lot of people were impacted by just the pummeling that took place in 2006 in Lebanon. And there was a subsequent shelling of picnickers on the Palestinian beach, which I know also moved me quite a bit. What other events led up for the group to be outraged and motivated to endeavor to break this?
There's events of attack too numerous to count. And since the mid-2000s, the kill ratio, that is dead Palestinians to dead Israelis, has been about 100 to 1. But the chief thing that motivated us is that Gaza is under siege, that around 2007, the Israeli government declared the entire Gaza Strip as a hostile entity, and there'd always been a siege to some degree, but then they really increased the siege. They limited what was able to be brought in and out of Gaza. They put an end to Gaza exports, and the reason was to try to pressure the Palestinian people to expel Hamas. Well, Hamas was elected in free and fair elections that were monitored internationally in 2006, 2007. And of course, so now we're punishing the Palestinians for practicing democracy.
So this is leading to the outrage among the group. I know there were 44 sailors, but there were so many more people that helped this come about.
Hundreds of people worldwide that helped us in this endeavor.
Do you think they all shared this outrage that Israeli threats and sadism can't go on?
Well, putting people under siege has always been an outrage. My father flew in the Berlin Airlift in 1949 when the Soviet Union tried to block off Berlin from the rest of the world. And so we had the Gaza sealift, which unfortunately we didn't have the budget of the Berlin Airlift, so we couldn't maintain it. But still, the principle is the same, that people should not be under siege. Throughout the history of the Mediterranean, that goes back thousands of years, seafarers from all the areas of the Mediterranean came and went, and prospered through international commerce. And today that's true except for Gaza, which has been around for 7,000 years, is locked off from the world. That is an outrage. And the fact that most Americans are barely aware of it, we needed to raise awareness of this fact.
So just for context, this voyage, this first voyage of the Free Gaza movement that set everything into motion subsequently for other voyages,
sure,
took place before the really cast lead operation.
Yeah, it was the summer before cast lead. And let me point out that Israel occupied Gaza in 1967, and since that time, no boats had been able to come or go into Gaza for 41 years straight.
And certainly after the gas discoveries in 1999, they've had interest exploiting the resources of Gaza.
My colleague David Schermerhorn in one of the final chapters of the book described, well, the chapter's called Stealing Gaza's Gas, and basically since 1999 there's been efforts to isolate those gas fields.
And this is the outrage that led to, basically propelled the Freedom Sailors to challenge the siege on Gaza.
Of course, it goes back to 1967. In 1967, there was a U.S. naval ship called the USS Liberty that was deliberately attacked by Israeli forces. 34 American sailors were killed, and about 171 American sailors were wounded. There's a colleague, James Ennis, who lives here in Woodinville, Washington, who wrote a book, Assault on the Liberty, that describes that. Well, that was all hushed up by the Johnson administration in 1967. And so there's been several efforts of where Americans have been attacked and the main American public is being kept in the dark. Other hypocrisies as well. Of course, in 2005, the Israelis pulled about 8,000 settlers off of 40% of the land in the Gaza Strip. And then they claimed that Gaza was free. Well, Gaza was not free. Land access to the world was blocked. Sea access to the world was blocked. Airspace was blocked. So they just...
Human rights were blocked.
They kept claiming that Gaza was free, so the Free Gaza movement decided we would challenge that notion and see if Gaza's free, then boats should be able to come and go into Gaza harbor by permission of the Gaza authorities and no one else.
When you arrived in Gaza harbor, the day after embarking, what was your cargo?
When you have 1.5 million people and you have 2 small fishing boats, your cargo is limited. And so, but we did bring a few tangible benefits. We brought in about 100 hearing aids for hearing impaired children at the Atfaluna Society, and we delivered those. We brought in EKG machines that we delivered to Al-Auda Hospital and some of its satellite clinics. And we brought hope primarily. We brought hope to the Gazan people.
I like that you brought hope to the Gazan people.
That they were not forgotten. And if you go to Gaza, I've been going to Gaza since 1985. I've been there countless times, usually through the permission of Israeli authorities. But when you get to Gaza, what you realize is that they're not a backward third world people. They have doctors, they have engineers, they have all kinds of educated people who are educated all around the world. But what they don't have is their freedom. What they don't have is commerce. And when you talk to people from Gaza who are 80% aid dependent at this point, is that they don't want charity as much as they want their freedom so that they can guide their own destiny and their own future.
You mentioned the crumbling medical infrastructure of Gaza, and that's directly related to unnecessary deaths.
And since this siege was tightened, medical supplies have been rationed, what actually gets in and out of Gaza.
Things like chemotherapy drugs.
Yeah, in the area of oncology, for example, there's cancer chemotherapeutic agents that are limited such that oncologists have to choose between giving one patient a full course of therapy versus giving several patients a partial course of therapy.
It's not related to Israel's security in any way whatsoever. It's just sadism.
Well, it does seem to be a little excessively cruel, and it defies explanation from a purely security standpoint. But what I would point out is that Israel always uses security as their excuse, and their security seems to always come at the expense of Palestinian and other people's security. For example, in Gaza, there is agricultural land, believe it or not. It's one of the most densely populated places on the planet, but on the periphery of Gaza, they had citrus groves. They had olive orchards. And most of these have been leveled by Israeli Caterpillar bulldozers and tanks, and the irrigation system's been ripped up. And that was all, and there's been a 300-meter security zone that's been expanded into Gaza, supposedly for Israeli security, but again, it interferes with Palestinians' ability to be self-reliant.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it has anything to do with Israeli security. It sounds a lot like sadism. And
well,
that was mentioned in the book.
They can use the excuse. It is true that a few Qassam bottle rockets have been fired out of these orchards. That's probably true. But again, Israel's security comes at massive. You totally interfere with the Palestinians' security. I'm for security of all people, not just one people. And I don't know how when Israel's security comes at the expense of Palestinian security, how does that lead to a better future?
Well, those Qassam rockets have harmed very few people. It's the old
to date, it's been
eye for an eyelash.
Yeah, to date it's been about 13 people in the last 12 years. Countless more have died on Israeli highways, yet they're not putting an end to cars in Israel.
Well, you mentioned that there was aid dependency as you explored again Gaza. You noticed the malnutrition there. It's not like they're not getting food. They're getting low quality food. They're not seeing vegetables. They're not getting good protein.
And of course, one of the successes of Free Gaza movement and the subsequent flotilla is that it has increased the pressure on Israeli authorities to loosen up what kind of foodstuffs are allowed into Gaza. But for many years, there is malnutrition, there's protein deficiency, there's kids who have growth stunting, who are losing their secondary teeth, whose cognitive abilities will probably be permanently impaired because during their growth years, they have not been able to get sufficient nutrition.
You also commented that it's like 10 to a room in Gaza. The density is unbelievable. That it's a land where the Arab just is to disappear.
Certainly, certainly be warehoused. My colleague Jeff Halper, who's Israeli and was on the boats with us, describes it as the warehousing of a population. But there are various terms: Bantustan concentration camp.
To put it in perspective, I worked out the numbers. You'd have to take Mexico City's population, double it, plop it into King County, and it still would only then just approximate the density of Gaza. Lauren Booth, who is sister-in-law to Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of Britain, made the analogy that it's a concentration camp rather than a prison.
That's in the book. She describes a British prison where inmates are guaranteed 3 square meals a day, that they have mental health counseling, that they have visits from relatives, and that they also know when their sentence is up.
And that they committed a crime to even be there.
And they had due process. Yeah. And of course, the people in Gaza have none of that. So Gaza they've described it as the world's largest prison, but if you look at definitions for concentration camp, which were initially coined to describe the Bantustans in South Africa, Gaza fits the definition of a concentration camp. Maybe not the death camps of the Nazis where people were systematically exterminated, but the fact remains, every time Israel attacks Gaza, it's like killing fish in a barrel. Massacres occur with large numbers of civilian deaths because people have nowhere to run.
Families being torn apart and how tragic that is. People that are only a few kilometers apart are separated basically forever. And
Sure.
It doesn't sound like that's security. It sounds like sadism.
There's a story of a young lady who was a Gazan who was married to a West Bank Palestinian, and she went through a checkpoint in the West Bank one day and they saw that she was born in Gaza and they deported her to Gaza, and she hasn't seen her husband or her 2 children in 17 months at the time that we interviewed her. There's all kinds of broken families like that.
This is a place where Arabs can disappear to. So I think Jeff Halper wrote that there's a prevailing attitude among the Israelis, the Arabs in our country, and if they can just be forgotten about in Gaza, then they don't have anything to worry about.
Well, let me read a little bit about what Jeff had to say. And this stupid conflict with its walls, siege, and violence is bad for everybody. Don't Israelis see that? People would ask me. The answer, unfortunately, is no. To be honest, we Israeli Jews are the problem. The Palestinians long ago accepted our existence in this country as a people and are willing to accept any solution. It is us who want exclusivity over the land of Israel. It is us who cannot conceive of a single country, who cannot accept the national presence of Palestinians. We talk about Arabs in our country, and who have eliminated by our settlements even the possibility of a two-state solution in which we take 80% of the land.
Mm-hmm. And that's all described in your newly released book, Freedom Sailors, which you co-edited with Greta Berlin. Talk a little bit about the Freedom Sailors. They're special. Certainly Jeff Halper is special, but in a sense, ordinary too. Ordinary in the sense that he's a family man, like most people who are not standing up and opposing Israeli outrages.
Well, the Israeli press described us as a group of, quote, left-wing radicals, which was laughable. A bunch of radicals? Well, we had Sister Anne Montgomery, who was a Catholic nun and daughter of a U.S. admiral. I'm a son of a U.S. Air Force colonel and a family doctor in a rural town in Washington State. We have civil engineers, attorneys, teachers, electricians, journalists, postal workers, information technology experts, experienced Greek mariners, a chemist, member of the Greek parliament amongst our passengers. And we have, yes, people who have years of experience in nonviolent direct action. Some of us have been to Gaza before, but most had not. Some had volunteered with the International Solidarity Movement. Some have been arrested and deported by Israel for being human rights activists. Some have been denied entry into Israel, not because we are violent, but because we are nonviolent, which is even more threatening to the Israeli occupiers who want to paint the entire Palestinian resistance movement as a bunch of violent terrorists. Yep, if we're a bunch of left-wing radicals, we certainly had our share of talented people.
Yeah. So you're a good cross-section of society, and that anybody listening to this show or who will read your book know that there is some action that they can take. And that brings us to basically the conclusion. What does your book really aspire to?
One more from the book. Vittorio Arrigoni, who was one of our Italian activists, who was unfortunately murdered subsequent to this while he was in Gaza, he wrote a poem. History is us. History is not cowardly governments with their loyalty to whoever has the strongest military. History is made by ordinary people, everyday people with a family at home and a regular job who are committed to peace as a great ideal to the rights of all, to staying human. History is us who risked our lives to bring utopia within reach, to offer a dream, a hope to hundreds of thousands of people who cried with us as we reached the port of Gaza. Our message of peace is a call to action for ordinary people like ourselves, not to hand over your lives to whatever puppeteer is in charge of this time around, but to take responsibility for the revolution, first to the inner revolution, to give love, to give empathy. It is this that will change the world. We have shown that peace is not an impossible utopia. Perhaps we have shown that sometimes utopia can be possible. Believe this, stand firm against intimidation, fear, and despair, and simply remain human.
And you said that he was murdered in Gaza.
Yeah, that happened, unfortunately, in April 2011.
Right.
Vittorio stayed in Gaza after our initial voyage. He was out at sea with some fishermen when the Israelis seized that ship and deported him. Vittorio infiltrated back into Gaza with a subsequent ship, and he was in and out of there, but he unfortunately was killed in Gaza in April. And the people who killed him, it remains mysterious.
But his whole point is that the siege will only end if it's challenged.
And we will keep on challenging. We're not done.
Jeff Halper, who's well known to many people as the director of the Israeli Coalition Against Home Demolitions. He's also been a guest on this Moral Politics show as well, and he said that the Israeli Jews cannot solve their apartheid problem. In fact, they don't want to solve their apartheid problem. They're living too well, and if they just ignore it, if Arabs can just be disappeared to Gaza, then all is fine.
There needs to be pressure from outside for people to come to terms with what they have created.
Do we need to basically address Jews of conscience, say, refuse to be enemies?
Absolutely, refuse to be enemies, and again, one of the successes of this country was separation of religion and state. Maybe the Holy Land should be a place where all people, whether they're Christian, Muslim, Jew, agnostic, or whatever, should have equal rights.
So it's ordinary people doing extraordinary things and taking on the threats and not being deterred by Israeli threats. And Israel, after all, is the only occupying power, so there's little doubt who needs to be opposed. But it raises the question, too. American stated foreign policy is in opposition to the objectives of the Free Gaza movement. How do we square that?
Unfortunately, yes. But again, I think that the principles for which we say we stand for as Americans are being systematically undermined. We say we're for democracy, but when the Palestinians elect their own government that isn't the one we want, we try to put them under siege in desperation. We say we're for freedom of press, but there are efforts all the time to undermine anyone who has the courage to question the policy of Israeli government. Both parties, Democratic and Republican, are woefully silent when it comes to the treatment of the Palestinian people, because most politicians fear that they can't criticize Israel for fear of having campaign funders from the pro-Israeli lobby undermine their efforts to get reelected.
Well, that's a really ominous development that is becoming more and more clear in this country, and I think as more people become activists, more people are willing to stand up for basic human rights, what's moral, which is why this show is done, then I think we might be able to have an American national policy, not an Israeli national policy carried out by America. Dr. Bill Dienst, I want to thank you again for another appearance on Moral Politics, a very insightful show. Thank you for recounting your experiences and those of others and the freedom voyages of the freedom sailors.
Thanks.